Okay, my apologies. My video cut me off in the middle of my thought. How rude. Let's continue on with the conditional. Um, as I was saying, notice here you just add the word if to the participle, which the verbal form would just be you believe. Here it's creating condition. If you believe, then you will receive. So that word if is nowhere in the Greek text. The translator has provided it so that you understand this participle as a conditional uh, participle, predicate participle. All right. All right, let's move on to concession. This will come up, by the way, in your worksheet. A very interesting example of a concessional or concessive participle, but I digress. Here we have an example from John 9:25. We have a participial form of the verb to be, which is just own. This is a nominative, plural masculine, or I'm sorry, singular masculine, present active participle. So it is matching the subject of the verb, which is I. Um, and so here we are translating this as even though. That's the key word for the concessive or the participle of concession. And then we have I was, which is the form of the verb to be. So that's actually the participle working there. And then we have the verb blind. Even though I was blind, now I see. Um, so we have once again this participle, even though I was, and then this noun here, blind, and then we have the verb now, or I'm sorry, the word now, which is this RT here, and then the present tense verb I see. So really, if you were just to translate this literally, it would just say, uh, being blind, now I see. You have some work to do as the interpreter to clarify the meaning of that, because there is much more implied in the Greek participle than we would convey in the English word being. It's not just being blind, now I see. The author is trying to say that even though I was at one time blind, now I see. And they can just communicate all that with that one word. All right. Then we get to the purpose. This is noted by the keywords in order that. So with the purpose that is kind of the idea that it conveys. And the example we have here is out of 2 Corinthians 1:23. We have the participle in order to spare. Uh, then we have you, which is just the pronoun in Greek, which is right here, humon. Then we have I no longer, that's that eti, came. There's our main verb, came to Corinth. So we just have very literally, sparing you, I did not come to, or I no longer came to Corinth. So sparing you, or I was sparing you, I no longer came to Corinth. Okay, now you need to help the audience once again. Sparing you. How can I better nuance that to help the audience? It's the purpose. The purpose for Paul no longer coming to Corinth was to spare. So I add the words in order to clarify the meaning of that participle. In order to spare you, I no longer came to Corinth. All right, so once again, you look at the main verb, you look at that phrase, I no longer came to Corinth, then you look at the participial phrase, spare, and you try to make sense of it in order to spare. Now, obviously, I'm pulling out examples where the translators in the New Testament have made it clear, because if they hadn't, then the text would make no sense. But there are some places where they leave the participle completely uninterpreted, and we have to make some decisions, or even better, disagree with some decisions that are made by the translators. But that will come much later in your career as biblical scholars. All right, let's move on to means before my computer rudely cuts me off again. Uh, for means, we have the keywords by or by means of. So it's easy to remember how to translate a participle of means because you use the word means. It is the means by which an activity is accomplished. All right. So, in our example of Matthew 6:27, who of you, by being anxious, is able to add 1 cubit to his lifespan? All right, so we need to look for our main verb. In this case, it is able, and the Greek correspondent here is dunatai. Um, this is an infinitive. We'll get to those next week. Those are verbal nouns. Hooray! Anyway, so that's our main verb, is able. Okay, so then we have to go back here to find our subject, who. Who is able among you? And then we just have our participle, being anxious. Okay. Who among you, being anxious, is able to add 1 cubit to his lifespan? Well, in order to make sense of this participle, we could do all kinds of things. So let's run over some of the ones that we've already experienced. Who of you, although being anxious, is able to add 1 cubit to his lifespan? Do you think this is a concessive participle? Well, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Let's try another one. Who among you or of you, uh, in order to be anxious, is able to add, no, it's definitely not purpose, right? So you see how you can kind of go through this process of what kind of participle is being used here. The translators have decided this is a participle of means, and so they have added the word by. You could even add the entire phrase by means of. Who of you, by means of being anxious, is able to add 1 cubit to his life? The author, the speaker is attempting to point out that this attempt, that is being anxious, is not a tool by which you are able to add a cubit to your lifespan. Therefore, it is a superfluous thing to do. Because it is using this idea of being anxious as a tool, then we think of it as the tool by which or by means of which we accomplish something. So this is a participle of means. That's the logic behind it. And then we have something, and I will just come right out and say this. This is the one that students struggle with the most. We don't often think of the word manner as a grammatical kind of category, but it absolutely is. And here's the best way I can describe it. A participle of manner describes the manner in which you are doing the action of the main verb. Okay, so are you running or are you running quickly? Now, in English, quickly is simply an adverb, right? We've already discussed those and we've seen them, that ly. But sometimes in Greek, they can use a participle functioning adverbially, all right? And it's just adding that idea right on to the main verb. So, for instance, we have in Acts 2:13, but others, mocking, were saying. So we just have this participle sitting here all by itself. But others mocking were saying. Well, so let's try some of our other options. By means of mocking, we're saying it's not the tool with which they're accomplishing the action. That doesn't make sense. In order to mock, they were saying maybe that it could be a purpose. This is the purpose with which they were saying this, but still, that you can see how that gets convoluted. Here, it makes the most sense to just say, but others were mockingly saying. That is, they were saying this in a mocking manner. All right. This, like I said, this is one that we just often struggle with in English to make it make sense because we never think of adverbs as adjectives, as verbal adjectives, but they absolutely are. So Greek can interchange those categories quite easily. So we get to be okay with that. Then we have, personally, my least favorite category, the attendant circumstance category. Really, the idea behind the attendant circumstance is it's just kind of stacking actions onto the main verb. Um, so, in the example I've given here, we have what's called a subject complement um, type. And I'm probably not going to give you a lot of these, but you need to be aware of them. So, here they are. This is a very comprehensive lecture. Um, the subject complement out of John 18:18, and Peter also was with them. So our main verb here is just the form of the verb to be, was with them. That's our main clause. And then we just have these two participles tacked on the end, standing and warming himself. All right. So it doesn't necessarily say that Peter was with them because he was standing and warming himself, though I suppose you could argue for a causal participle here. But really, in the long run, this makes more sense to just say these are the things he was doing while he was there. He was standing and warming himself. And then we have an example of a predicate complement. So notice the standing and warming, they complemented the subject Peter. That's why they're called subject complement. Here, the predicate complement, we have on the next day, he sees Jesus coming. Okay, so the reason it's called a predicate complement here is simply because Jesus is the direct object, otherwise known as part of the predicate of the phrase, not the subject, and that participle is attached to Jesus because it is in the accusative case and Jesus is in the accusative case. And so it's just stacking an action on to Jesus, instead of giving him his own main verb. So it's not Jesus because he was coming or Jesus by means of coming. All those categories don't fit here. This is just a simple action, and so is referred to as a participle of attendant circumstance. There's probably a less cumbersome way to title that, but there you go. I also want you to just read over the section on periphrastic participles. The basic idea with these is they're being paired with the form of the verb to be and then just turning it into regular verbs. And so you have a few examples where instead of just putting the verb to bear fruit, they put the verb to be and then put a participial form of the verb bearing fruit. So it is bearing fruit instead of a less cumbersome way of writing it. So it's more of a periphrastic participles are more stylistic than anything else. So don't get too bogged down in those. I'm not going to ask you a lot of questions on them, but I gave you quite a few examples because once again, this is an exhaustive lecture, but I'm encroaching on 30 minutes of your time. And so I'm just going to wrap this up. There are some things here about the tense of participles and how that influences how they're translated, whether or not they're simultaneous action or they're antecedent action, how the aorist tense works, how the future tense works, and so on, how the perfect, obviously. And then the section on genitive absolutes. Really, just skim over that stuff and pay the most attention to all the different kinds of predicate participles because that's where the bread and butter is with participles. All this stuff will fall into place if you continue on in your studies. We just don't have the time and the space to really dive into it here. Okay, just be aware of it. And then I will say, after tomorrow, when you kind of read through all this and listened to me drone on for 30 minutes, I'm going to post a very short list of all of the options for a predicate participle so you can just access it very quickly. Okay, so for your homework and such, you can look for the more in-depth examples in this lecture, but I will give you the more concise version so you can reference that for your homework. So happy Greeking, lots of reading, lots of listening to me this week, lots of practice, hopefully. And you may or may not be working with a few participles in your word studies for your passage. So hopefully this will help. I will see you on the forums.